Portsmouth is a great city. A great waterfront city, so they say. At least, that's what the media wants you to believe. You see, the media will never show you the full picture, especially not when it comes to such a dire place like Portsmouth. So instead, it will usually just choose to represent certain key aspects of the place that it's portraying. The problem is, you can never understand the full extent of a location solely by looking at representations of it. And this is especially true for places like Portsmouth, where there are both must-see tourist attractions rich with history, and such a deprived and poverty-stricken population. Nowhere is this fact more evident than across a location's tourism board. This makes sense, as the whole point of a tourism board is to convince you to travel to the location, and nobody is going to want to go to the location if you show them its levels of homelessness. But I feel like this is particularly bad in Portsmouth. Like, here's a map of all the city's top tourist attractions as listed by the Portsmouth Tourism Board. Like, they're all right next to each other. Like, I get that these places are probably some of the nicest places in the city, and that if you were to go to just these locations and nowhere else, you would think that the city is a really nice place. But this is still a really shallow representation of Portsmouth as a whole. This trend also carries over to how the city is represented by the wider media, most notably within Mr. Bean. Yes, Mr. Bean. Now, unlike other films and television shows filmed in Portsmouth, the 2 episodes of Mr. Bean which were filmed in the city are actually set in Portsmouth. Heck, it even says so on their plot summaries. And whilst these episodes are mainly focused around Mr. Bean and his antics, they also work to represent the city, especially since a lot of the show's comedy stems from environmental storytelling. But the problem is that these episodes arguably do an even worse job at representing Portsmouth as a whole. In the first of these 2 episodes, Mr. Bean in room 426, Bean is shown staying in one of the city's hotels and getting up to his usual shenanigans during his stay. That sounds fine until you realise that the hotel he's staying in is the Queen's Hotel, which just so happens to be one of the most luxurious hotels in Portsmouth. Right, not a great start, but surely the next episode will give a broader view of the city. No, of course not. The second episode, Mind the Baby Mr. Bean, revolves entirely around the fun fair, which, whilst not being as upper class as the first episode, still shows the city in an unnaturally positive light without adequately representing the city as a whole. And sure, that's probably just to drive the episode's narrative forward, but it still barely represents Portsmouth correctly. Even outside of Mr. Bean's antics, the wider media still does a terrible job of representing the city, especially across national news. However, the national news' representation of Portsmouth is incredibly narrow for a completely different reason, because of football. Take the Daily Mail for example. Being one of the most popular newspapers in the country, it doesn't really care about what's occurring in the dinky city of Portsmouth unless it directly involves the wider country. And, wouldn't you know it, pretty much the only thing that does that properly is the football team. Now, I would argue that this representation of the city is the worst so far, particularly because nobody wants their hometown to be known as the place with this crap football team. So if the national media does such a poor job at representing Portsmouth, surely more local media will do a better job, right? Well, kind of. Take the local MPs for example. In all of the media which they produce about their half of the city, other than putting the same vaguely uninterested face in every photograph, they do work to make light of some of the city's issues like water pollution and homelessness. Whilst this certainly may seem like a much more accurate representation of the city, there is one glaring problem. All of the issues that they choose to represent are issues which they are personally working to improve. This means that 1, they're not showing every issue which affects Portsmouth, and 2, they're not showing the full extent of the issues that they're representing so that they can portray themselves in a more positive and heroic light. But what about other local media? Well, there are some more accurate representations of Portsmouth available, most notably the Portsmouth News. Because the news doesn't really have any reason to lie or misrepresent the city in any way, it will typically give the most accurate representation of the city, far more accurate than any of the other media products that I've looked at today. However, there are some flaws in the news' representation. For one, because it's trying to sell as many newspapers as possible, it may sometimes over-exaggerate on some issues. Like, I don't think anyone is too upset at needing to travel an extra 8 minutes to get to a bank. But the slightly bigger issue with the news is the fact that, because the point of the newspaper is to provide current information, it does not fully represent the city unless certain parts of the city are relevant on a day-by-day basis. Because of this, even though it is the best representation of Portsmouth, the news still doesn't show the full picture. So in conclusion, I don't think that any media product will ever fully represent a location such as Portsmouth. With such a diverse and fascinating history clumped together with one of the most deprived cities in the country, it would be impossible to show everything all in one product. So at the end of the day, believe whatever representation of Portsmouth you want to believe. Just don't believe Mr. Bean.